Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, director of the Institute, and very pleased to welcome all of you to this Special Policy Forum luncheon debate. We don't often do debates, and this is a debate among serious people on a serious topic, so you won't see the gloves on and the blood flying. But it is an important issue to talk about U.S. policy towards Syria. An audience like this and an audience that is watching on C-SPAN knows very well the issues that are at stake, the humanitarian issues that are at stake, of course, the political, the military, and the strategic issues that are at stake. There is a broad national, broad consensus about the urgency of the situation in Syria, but yet considerable debate about what the United States should do and what the United States should be leading in order to affect the situation on the ground. We at the Institute, the Washington Institute, have been actively engaged in trying to present a broad range of information to the policymaking community. In addition to our speaker today from the Institute, Andrew, I want to draw attention to everyone here and to our viewing audience at the Washington Institute's website, which includes data from firsthand visits to the region by Institute staff visiting all bordering countries around Syria, detailed reports based on these investigations and policy prescriptions. Today, we are brought together two of the most thoughtful and insightful observers of the situation in Syria, and as much the situation here in Washington about Syria, because today's discussion is really about what America should do vis-a-vis the conflict in Syria. And the springboard for today's discussion is an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by the Council on Foreign Relations by Andrew Tabler. Andrew is a senior fellow here at the Washington Institute, an author of a book based on his 8 years living in Syria. And the article that Andrew has written is titled "Syria's Collapse and How Washington Can Stop It." In that article, Andrew offers both analysis of the situation in Syria and a set of very specific prescriptions for what the United States should do on its own and in concert with partners and allies in order to stop the carnage and stop the violence and bring about a resolution of the conflict. Speaking today as well is Professor Marc Lynch. I'm very happy to welcome Marc back to this platform. This is not the first time that Marc has spoken at the Institute, and we're very happy to welcome him back. Marc is professor at George Washington University. Marc is the prodigious author of the Aardvark blog and a frequent contributor to Foreign Policy, among many other platforms. And if you want to find a coherent alternative view about what the United States ought to do vis-a-vis Syria, then I suggest reviewing a series of foreign policy posts by Marc. And so we have today two very smart, two very well-respected and consulted experts. I won't go into the details of the consultations each of them has with senior government officials, but suffice to say that the arguments that we'll be hearing today very much reflect the arguments that are on the table in front of senior government officials. Now, of course, we've had a change in American policy in just the last couple of weeks with the President's announcement of the beginning of a direct U.S. military support to, of lethal weaponry to the armed opposition. But I think it still suffices to say that the overall strategy remains unclear. What the objectives are, what they ought to be, and whether we are bringing to bear the resources to meet those objectives. And so in that context, I think today's debate remains very much timely and very much appropriate. With that, I'll turn the podium first over to Andrew Tabler, and then over to Marc Lynch, and then over to you for your questions and your comments. Andrew. Oh, one more. Just one more word. If I could please ask everybody here to silence your cell phones, turn them off if you can, silence if you must.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and thanks to the Washington Institute and all of my colleagues here in all their capacities for helping with today's event. Thanks to all of you for coming out. In particular, thanks to Professor Marc Lynch for accepting the invitation today to discuss an issue that I think both of us believe is a crisis of the first order, and one that, as we were just discussing a little bit before this began, we've been talking about behind closed doors for a better part of 2 years now, and that has followed the debate that we have seen inside of the U.S. government, or heard about, or heard echoes of, that come out of policymaking circles about the difficulties of coming up with policy prescriptions to deal with the Syria crisis. So, and perhaps my last bit of thanks goes to President Obama himself for his recent decision to recognize that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has, according to U.S. assessments, used chemical agents in Syria, and the decision to increase military support to Syria's rebels. And as Rob mentioned, I think that we are in an era of policy flux. We don't know all the details, and I think that's going to be where a lot of the debate is going to be going forward. The article that Rob discussed, the recent article in Foreign Affairs about Syria's collapse, was based on a recent trip I made with my colleague and good friend Jeff White to Syrian border regions. We were in every Syrian border region with the exception of Iraq. I think that the one thing that came away from that trip, and this dovetails with our policy report when we came back earlier this year, and one thing that struck me, and the theme that I think will carry us through a lot of my comments, at least today, is that the Syria that I lived in for so long, and the one that I've been writing on for quite some time, and the one that you know very well, either through direct interaction or indirect interaction or whatever, is just simply Chernobyling, not to mix nuclear metaphors here. Quite frankly, the crisis that is generated, from that, from that environment, now I think is a threat to the regional security architecture, and is likely to suck in not only a lot more of the regional powers, but also threatens to suck in many of the great international powers as well. And this all opens up major challenges for the United States going forward. We are, I am afraid, at the beginning of this conflict, not at its end. I can't see how it would end anytime soon. It's a very sad truth. The basis of my argument is fairly simple. It's given the trajectories that I see inside of Syria, which I'll explain here, and I think have been echoed in recent government announcements. It's not now a question of if we get involved in Syria, but when, how, and at what cost. Important attention has to be paid to outcomes and goals, and Marc has been writing about this recently, and I agree with him. We might not be able to completely end the Syria crisis. We might be, but by becoming more involved through an assertive and measured approach, as I argued, I believe we can shape an outcome that's in keeping with our interests and contain it as much as possible within Syria's borders. So my foreign affairs piece, I'd like to say, follows a lot of President Obama's recent responses in Charlie Rose's interview. I'm sure that he didn't read it and then just go and regurgitate the Charlie Rose. What I want to say here is that I think the president outlined very clearly what U.S. interests were, at least according to the way he saw it. First, there was what he articulated, a humanitarian interest. And this is the first part of my piece. It talks about the destruction and the death toll in Syria. We've hit 100,000 killed, depending on the numbers, just this month in Syria. Now, this is the number killed approximately in Bosnia, but in about half the time. So it's as the aid workers in Syria say, it's Bosnia on steroids. And of course, this 100,000 marker and this is going to be a war that involves a lot of markers, I think, very sadly, comes on around the second anniversary, or just before the second anniversary of President Obama saying that President Bashar al-Assad had to step aside. The death tolls inside of Syria now are worse than the death tolls in Iraq at the height of the conflict in 2007. There are also considerable regional interests that the president outlined, which are now at risk. And I think this is something that had not really entered the policy considerations previously. There have been a number of talks, and Marc's been writing about this, about the humanitarian situation and a response based on that argument. Then we have the response based on checking Iranian influence. I think now he pointed out very clearly that the outflow of refugees into Jordan, and that's where Jeff and I recently spent a lot of time, was so massive, as well as to other countries that we had also visited, that those countries were simply unable to handle them. And that somehow the previous arguments in policy-making circles that we could deal with the symptoms of this crisis alone and not the disease itself, that those arguments were wearing thin based on the numbers that we saw coming out of Syria. And so those of you that have been there, I think, have noted that, and have been to the north, the Zatari refugee camp now in Jordan represents the country's fourth largest city. And I encourage you to go there if you can, and talk with the people who are running the camp. You can go into the camp if you like. There's actually very little security. It's a wonder it all stays together inside. Outside's another matter. So that's another major area of spillover. But then the president outlined what he called a direct interest. And this is was the use of chemical weapons, chemical agents in this particular situation, various concentrations of sarin, according to U.S. Government officials. So this is also a major concern, and one that threatened to take this crisis and all of the displacement that has been generated from it, and to basically supercharge that situation and send people running over the border or into neighboring governorates for cover, and to stay out of these areas where these chemical agents could be used. And that, we expect, will continue without a check on President Assad and trying to deter him from going up his escalation chain in terms of the lethality of his arsenal. But I think the biggest takeaway that I had from my trip, and one that I think a lot of my fellows here at the Institute share, is that the division of the country into these three general areas that I outlined, the regime-controlled area in the west, the Sunni Arab-controlled area in the center, and the Kurdish-controlled areas in the east. In each one of these areas, we see not just U.S.-designated terrorist organizations present, we see them ascendant, okay, and a key part of each area's ability to go on the offensive, not only vis-a-vis each other, but politically within those areas. So you saw the Hezbollah recently and the capture of Qusair from the rebel forces. You see the role of Jabhat al-Nusra, both in terms of hard power, in terms of battling the regime, as well as soft power and reaching out to the Syrian population. And then, of course, we have the PYD, the local variant of the PKK, also present in Kurdish areas. Now, why does this all matter to Americans, right? Many people have pointed to a number of polls which indicate that most Americans do not want to intervene inside of Syria. There are different responses about what that intervention might look like, but generally there's a lot of skepticism for various reasons that have to do with the recent Iraq, our involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan, finances, and so on. I think that the biggest that I see strategic threat that's emerging out of all of this really it took me back to my original discussions with policymakers when I came to Washington about 5 years ago, when I had to leave Syria. And that is location, 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 okay? For the first 2 years of the Obama administration, we engaged the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, not because we liked him, not because his behavior was particularly good, actually it was awful, but it was based on the idea that Syria was very important, not only in signing a peace treaty with Israel, and perhaps reorienting away from Iran, but also because of Syria's geographic location. It doesn't have a lot of oil, it doesn't export a lot of goods, its people are very friendly, and its food is the food they prepare is very good, but by and large, we didn't have a lot of U.S. interests there, to be fair, right? But we had a lot of interest in the countries that surrounded Syria: Israel, Jordan, Iraq, where we spent billions of dollars, NATO member Turkey, and Lebanon, where the U.S. doesn't have necessarily direct interests, but a lot of historical interests and remaining military interests there in various shapes and forms. So I tried to think a little bit about this, and I kept on hearing every time we would talk about why those that said that we shouldn't get more involved in Syria would say, well, look what happened in Lebanon. Lebanon caught on fire and literally burned down several times. And for those of you that are from there or have visited the country, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you know what? In the end, it didn't destroy the region. It didn't really threaten things, right? You know, and I think that the analogy that immediately came to mind was that for all the horrific things that happened in Lebanon during that time, Lebanon is the small row house on the end of the block, okay? And I think this is something that everybody here can relate to. And the block here is the regional security architecture, the Sykes-Picot boundaries that have divided up the Middle East for almost 100 years. So Lebanon was stabilized, and the sectarian dimension of it was contained by the involvement of the two end row houses, Israel, and then a much more stable Syria with much different demographics. And it was containable, and the Lebanese war was eventually brought to a finish through the Taif Accord, and really a settlement that has never really been fully implemented, was not necessarily terribly successful, but has brought relative peace to the country. And it was very much a situation of splitting the baby down the middle, to mix a bad metaphor. The case of Syria is the row house in the middle of the block, okay? And the problem with what we see inside of Syria is that, that what happens there doesn't stay there, okay? It's not like Vegas, where, you know, whatever happens there stays there. It actually, the potential for spillover is so great and has accelerated after the last few months, whether it's the refugees that I outlined or through the involvement of Hezbollah. I mean, if you would have told me a couple of years ago, and I have many friends in the audience, that, you know, Andrew, in a short period of time, you're going to watch Hezbollah rocket fire another Arab country for an hour from Lebanese territory, you've got to be crazy, right? It's the equivalent of hell freezing over. And yet I've seen it in the last few months. And those of you have been tracking also the involvement of Hezbollah inside of the country. So I don't think what's happening in Syria will just stay in Syria. I think it's less and less containable. And I think that, in and of itself, threatens not only Syria's neighbors, but the security architecture as well in the region. Okay? Right now, it's refugees and cross-border fire. In the future, it could be the destabilization of different border areas of Syria. Northern Jordan immediately comes to mind. Southern Turkey, Hatay province. And it's true, things don't all the time. Things don't often burn down immediately. But over time, and given that we don't have a solution to this crisis, and that a political one doesn't seem to be in the offing, at least an easy one, I think that the potential for this to spread is much, much greater. And I think it then deserves greater U.S. attention. So my prescriptions in the paper are ones that I've discussed with Marc many times, or we've discussed in meetings we've had either in and outside of government circles, and are not unknown to most of you. There are four parts. One is, I believe that the first step to all of this is we need to enforce the chemical weapons use red line with President Assad. One, I think it gets down to American credibility. When you lay down these lines, you should enforce them. And the choices of not doing so reverberate out beyond this crisis, and it will affect our decision. Will affect how we're perceived in the region and beyond. And I think that's a big concern of many of those in the military. But I think most importantly, if we don't enforce that red line, I think that there is every indication, based on the evidence, that President Assad is moving up the escalation chain, right? So he's already using chemical weapons. His use of surface-to-surface missiles are already the third most used against the civilian population in the history of the world, right? First Adolf Hitler, the Najibullah regime in Afghanistan is second, and then the Assad regime, okay? So, you know, in the use on civilian populations, whether the enemy or his own population, is, you know, it's there. And I think unless we deter him from doing that, he's going to keep using them. That's going to cause more people to run over the borders of muhafazas inside of Syria and over the borders to neighboring countries and potentially destabilize them. Second, I think that in order to contain this crisis and the displacement, we need to set up safe havens in Syrian border regions. Many of you have seen that I've written about this before. These areas would be adjacent to Turkey and to Jordan, at least at first, and could be enforced using Patriot missile batteries or aircraft flying there. By the way, these are not the only options, and I say that in the paper. There are many COAs, or courses of action, that we've discussed over the last year or so that vary from using Patriot missile batteries to more direct action with U.S. aircraft flying over those areas. With more direct U.S. involvement flying over Syria, the risks, of course, go up, and it's much more expensive. Next, I believe that if we've decided that President Assad has to go and that President Assad going is part of the solution, we need to be able to work with the opposition in order to achieve that militarily and politically. The reason why I want President Assad to go isn't just because he's a bad guy. The reason why President Assad, in my opinion, has to go is that he lost his chance to reform his country and to deal with the demographic wave that is now overcoming that regime. The Assad regime has proved very rigid over time. It has been unable to reform, other than to open up a couple of banks and insurance companies, and that which is patently not reform, and has been unable to deal with the big elephant in the room here, and that is, and if you notice, all the armed fighters, they have black beards and black hair and very, very little gray, and that's because what you're seeing in Syria is authoritarian karma. Following the Hama massacre of February of 1982, there was a massive crackdown, as many of you know, inside of Syria. Hard currency dried up, the economy contracted, and so for that 10 years, even Arab nationalists and communists were arrested. And what happened is everyone just stayed home and had a lot of children. And during that period of time, and I learned this from Asma al-Assad herself, Syria was among the 20 fastest growing populations on the planet. Okay? And that was why many people inside of Syria were actually pushing Bashar al-Assad to reform. He couldn't, that system can't reform, and that system and President Assad need to go in order to bring a true transition from a tyrannical and very rigid form of government into something more accommodative to the demographics inside of that country. That's true stabilization, in my opinion, and one that can work from the inside out. In order to do that, we need to work with the Syrian opposition in border regions of Syria, both from Turkey and Jordan and beyond, as well as perhaps in the future into these safe areas, depending on if they're developed and when and over what periods of time. And there are a lot of details about that in my paper. Then at the end of this, I advocate diplomacy. I don't think that we should don't think we should throw it away. I think it's something that we should always keep open. But I don't think at this point, and I think the facts bear me out, that what we see, the Geneva II process is going to yield either talks or anything that would lead to a true transition that would deal with the difficult situation inside of that country. What I see in the future at the end of this is a Syria that remains divided into three areas: regime-controlled in the west, Sunni Arab in the center, and Kurds out in the east, with various borders and many of these areas non-contiguous. And that at the end of this process, we should try, as this conflict unfolds, to bring those pieces back together. That is a very, very distant goal at this point. But I think it is worth trying to keep Syria together, whether it's in a I don't think in its current form is possible, perhaps something more decentralized. And as part of those negotiations, perhaps at long last, those who are huddled around the regime, and particularly the Alawi community, might feel more confident and safe when behind their lines to have President Assad and his immediate family leave the scene. And that might give them the kind of guarantees that they would like in an interim, so that they didn't feel, as many minorities have told me who come out of Syria, that a transition in Syria would mean having their heads chopped off. And I can understand that fear, and I can understand the fact that the regime has been pumping this fear through the media in order to keep them huddled around this regime. And so instead of starting with diplomacy and without the Syrian people at the UN Security Council, I think we should start with the Syrian people and then end with diplomacy, hopefully at the UN Security Council, but if not, we would have to have some other kind of diplomatic process I recommended, for example, Switzerland, Norway, but there are a number of other actors that might be able to step in and help us negotiate a peaceful and hopefully stable end to this horrific crisis. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll hand it over to Marc. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here on an extremely hot Friday afternoon at the end of June. And I'd like to thank Rob for inviting me back here. He says that he doesn't usually host debates, but oddly, every time I come here, I end up in the middle of one. I'm not sure why that is exactly. And I'd like to thank Andrew for the hard work that he's been doing on the Syria issue over the last few years. Both Rob and Andrew have alluded to the many, many workshops, events, discussions that we've been involved with. And one of the things that most impresses me about Andrew and I think a number of other people who I see around in this room is that they've been focused on trying to solve problems in Syria instead of having what I think are fairly idle partisan debates about them and trying to deal with Syria as it actually is and trying to find workable solutions. And I think that's what we all need to be working on. Now, authors don't choose their own titles. As the editor of the Middle East channel on foreignpolicy.com, I get to choose the titles on those articles, but on Foreign Affairs, Andrew's article is entitled Syria's Collapse, and How Washington Can Stop It. I fully and completely agree with the main head. Syria is collapsing. The state has collapsed. The humanitarian horrors, the strategic void, everything which he describes, I think more or less goes along with my understanding of what's happening in Syria. We have almost no disagreements in our assessment of the strategic situation, of the reality or the dangers of the collapse of the Syrian state, or of the general balance of forces in the ground. Or, for that matter, on the moral and strategic imperative to try and ameliorate and solve the problems there, or on the likely reality of a war and a civil war that's going to stretch on for a long time. In other words, that there's no easy or quick fix to the problems of Syria. Our disagreement primarily lies in the subhead, which some associate editor added, probably without asking permission, how Washington can stop it, because I don't think Washington can stop it. I think that Washington can do some things. I think that it has been doing some things. It might be able to try some other things. But at the end of the day, the magnitude of what is happening in Syria is well beyond the ability of the United States to control, to shape, or to decisively end. And I want to be very clear what I mean by this, because most of the debate, including Andrew's, is around a certain set of limits. I can't tell you how many times in the last couple of years I've heard the words, nobody is talking about boots on the ground. And I say, thank God, that nobody's talking about boots on the ground. My point is that even with boots on the ground, all in, Iraq style, 150,000 troops occupying Damascus, we couldn't stop this. We proved it in Iraq. That all in doesn't mean we could actually solve this problem. We could overthrow Assad, no question about that. We could kill him, we could destroy his regime. But then we have to solve the problem of a collapsed state, a shattered society, and the repatriation of what is left and what has been left behind. And I think that any serious discussion, and I include Andrew very much in this category of serious discussion, has to begin from the premise that of trying to understand what Syria is going to look like at the end of this game, in the middle of this game, as well as right now. And when we talk about if only the president would do this, if only he would arm the rebels, if only he would create a safe area, if only he would really mean it when he says that Assad must go, all the problems would be solved, I don't think any serious person really believes that. Andrew certainly doesn't. And I think that we need to understand that our arguments and discussions are taking place at the margins, where we might marginally affect the humanitarian situation, the strategic situation, the political situation, but the magnitude of what's happened in Syria is well beyond the ability of any minor fix or even a major fix coming from Washington. Now, what that means is that it is absolutely and completely true that the president's strategy for Syria has not solved the problems of Syria. I think parts of his strategy have been useful, parts of them have been disastrous, parts of them have simply been good ideas that haven't worked out. But it's very clear that when you have a situation with 100,000 dead, millions of refugees and displaced, sectarianism spreading like wildfire throughout the region, it's pretty clear that's not a policy that you'd want to hold up as a glowing success. The problem is that none of the major alternatives on offer are any better. And I often hear from Senator McCain and others that everything which the critics predicted would happen if we intervened has happened anyway. And in some ways that's true. Syria is an absolute disaster. But we are not embedded neck deep in a quagmire, with American troops now caught in the relentless pressure to expand our commitments, to go deeper, stay longer, have a surge of troops, try new counterinsurgency strategies. People talk about the slippery slope like it's, it's like a throwaway thing where it's, okay, the slippery slope, we're worried about that, now let's get on with things. You can't do that. You have to think about what happens when step one doesn't work. So I think that actually we need to think about the various policies on offer. I actually think 3 of the 4 of what Andrew puts forward, I'm happy with all 4 of his, except for he didn't quite completely describe number 1, which was not just enforcing the deterrence on conventional weapons, it was airstrikes to try and take out the chemical weapon sites, right? In the article. Basically, I think there has to be a firm and clear line between any kind of direct American military intervention, and then beneath that, a whole range of things that we can consider their likely efficacy. I believe that the current moves to openly arm the rebels comes uncomfortably close to that line, but doesn't cross it. I think that airstrikes, the enforcement of safe areas, or at least the declaration of safe areas, with stated or unstated commitment to enforce them, crosses that line. Once we're across that line, unless you can give me a clear story by which the conflict ends, then I think we are on a slippery slope that leads to exactly what everyone says they're not talking about, which is relentless escalation, because once you're in, you're in. You can't say, oh, that didn't work, we're going to walk away. Those of you who remember the debate about Libya circa July of 2011, when it didn't look like it was working, will remember that the same people who argued that originally they were never talking about boots on the ground, they started talking about boots on the ground, because once you're in it, you got to win it. And so I think that we do need to be extremely cognizant, not just of step 1, but of step 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, let me talk about some of those steps and kind of my general sense of how this is playing out and what I think we can and cannot do. I think that generally speaking, the argument about arming the rebels, which has dominated the debate in Washington for quite a while, has largely been a red herring, largely irrelevant. I wrote something over a year ago, roughly February of 2012, where I said I expected that this was where we were going to go. Why were we going to go there? Because of what I just said a minute ago, that it would be a way of showing that we were doing something without actually getting ourselves directly committed to military intervention. Bureaucratically speaking, that's what happens. You can't do nothing, that looks bad. You're definitely not going to go all in, so you find something in the middle you can do, which isn't actually going to solve the problem, but it might help a little bit on the margins. I'm surprised it took so long, but I don't think it matters very much. There was a point at which it mattered. That was roughly between November of 2011 and March of 2012, when you were seeing a debate taking place inside the Syrian opposition and across the region about whether to shift from a peaceful uprising to a militarized insurgency. And that was a serious debate, and there were very real reasons at that time to avoid the militarization of the conflict. My fear at the time, the reason I argued against it at the time, and many others in this room did as well, is because of the recognition that Assad had an extraordinarily difficult time dealing with a nonviolent challenge, a moral challenge, where it was a peaceful uprising in the Arab Spring spirit against a brutal authoritarian regime. It commanded the world's sympathy. It told people inside of Syria that there might be a safe, useful, and better alternative to the Assad regime. It told the minority communities that they might have a safe future in such a regime. It had the opportunity to reach out across sectarian lines and to prevent the spread of this sectarian fear, the collapse of the state, and the unleashing of extremely predictable dynamics and logics of militarization. Unfortunately, because Assad proved that he was willing to carry out unspeakable brutality against the Syrian people and very, I think, cynically used this strategy of brutality in order to push the opposition into a militarized response. In other words, I think he helped to push them there because he wanted to fight on that ground, a ground where he was much more confident of winning. And he was right. I think that the militarization has been a disaster for the Syrian revolution, and almost everything which was predicted by the Syrian advocates of nonviolent uprisings has been validated. I think there are very few fence-sitters left in Syria. I think Syria's minority communities are absolutely terrified of the victory of what is increasingly seen as a Sunni Islamist insurgency. And I think that we now have a strategic stalemate, which is very much at the expense of the Syrian people. And I see very little possibility of either side, the opposition or Assad, reestablishing control or a viable, functional Syrian state anytime in the future. I actually expect there to be at least 5 years of civil war if and when, whether or if Bashar al-Assad falls, whether he survives. I simply see that the logic of militarization has gone far too far to be overturned at this point. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and I support most of the things that Andrew is discussing, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the reality is that the militarization and the transformation from an uprising into an insurgency has been a moral and strategic and political disaster, one which Assad courted and got, and now, again, has brought Syria to where it is now. Now, that was a year and a half ago when this debate mattered, and now it doesn't really matter because it's fully militarized. This is now a multi-sided, complex, internationalized insurgency in which we are debating about how and the modalities by which we will support an insurgency. This is very different from where we were before. So I guess what it comes down to now is trying to figure out whether the kinds of steps that Andrew was talking about are likely to help this insurgency not win. That's actually not necessarily the goal that we're fighting for. That's part of the problem, is we haven't defined our goals. Whether different ways of supporting that insurgency are more or less likely to produce results that are likely to serve American interests. And to this point, those interests have been defined, in my view, correctly as trying to find some kind of political transition which preserves what rudimentary functioning of the state remains and find some way to prevent what otherwise seems to be an inevitable cycle of revenge killings, state failure, state breakdown, i.e. essentially Afghanistan 1990 or Somalia, which is where it appears that we're headed. Now, it could be that the steps being discussed here would accomplish that. And it could be that Syria is unique. And I think that every case is unique, and Syria is just as unique as every other case. But what comparative experience and most political science studies of this kind of external support for insurgencies tell us is that this kind of international support for an insurgency, which is usually going to the weaker side, that's why they need international support, tends to make wars longer and bloodier, tends to make it more difficult to find a negotiated outcome at the end, tends to create and exacerbate dynamics of state failure and the entrenchment of political economies of those people who benefit from the black markets associated with insurgency, and ultimately make it less likely that you will have a democratic or stable regime when the war finally ends, as most wars do eventually end. Now, it could be, again, that Syria is different and that it will go differently this time. I would feel more comfortable if anybody, and it hasn't happened in 2.5 years now of having these arguments, if anybody could point me to a single case in the history of the world where such a strategy has worked. If that could happen, and it's extremely frustrating to me that we haven't been able to find one, and I'm sure in Q&A we can talk about some of the examples that are probably immediately popping to mind. The French support for the American Revolution is not going to cut it. If you have to go back that far and take such a radically different case, then I'm not convinced. Okay, so the logic of arming rebels then, given everything that I've just said. essentially boils down to, I mean, the logic of this has been fully, this has been fully adjudicated on the op-ed pages. You all know the basic logic of why we've moved towards trying to arm the rebels. Basically, the logic is that if we start arming the Syrian rebels, a couple of things will happen. One, will stabilize the battlefield, prevent the rebels from losing, and enable them to basically respond to what many people after Qusayr seem to think is the regime's military advantage. Secondly, for those of us, including Andrew, who supports a diplomatic endgame, that will be more likely to get an acceptable endgame if the rebels are able to bargain from a position of strength. Third, there's the broad recognition that, that there are these jihadist groups that are part of the insurgency, and they are stronger than the groups that we would like to support. So if we give them weapons, they'll be stronger. They might be able to weaken the appeal of the jihadists and the radicals, peel away some of their supporters, recruit them to their side. And therefore, by arming the opposition, we both further the battle against Assad and weaken the jihadists who alarm us. And then finally, this will then give us a greater say, a greater stake, and a greater influence over post-war Syria. We will win the gratitude, the political support, and basically have a role in post-Assad Syria after the rebels that we've armed have either won or negotiated a transition. This sounds good, and I've heard it expressed extremely well by many people, including some in this room, and I'm simply not convinced of any step in the causal chain. 4 steps, I'm not convinced by any one of them. The argument that the U.S. providing arms would make a significant difference in the strategic equation rests on a couple of assumptions that I don't think are right. The first is that they currently can't get weapons. Syria is afloat in weapons. Weapons have been flowing for the last year and a half, and the U.S. would be entering into a crowded market of weapons. And it is not like it was a year and a half ago, where you have first movers advantage, and you could make a strategic qualitative difference through the introduction of weapons. Now, you become one player in a crowded field of potential armors. Number one, then, is that, yes, of course, you will strengthen them if you give them more or better weapons. But this is a change on the margins, not a change in type. Number two, this would matter the most. And this will get to the point I actually am going to say something positive towards the end. This would matter the most if, and only if, we were able to establish a unified supply chain in which we were the only supplier of weapons, or at least were able to direct the flow of weapons from our allies in the Gulf, in Turkey, in Jordan, etc. In other words, unify the flow of weapons into a unified political opposition, which would then have oversight over a unified military force. But none of those conditions apply. We don't agree on the goals with our major allies. The Saudis and the Qataris spend more time competing with each other over influence within the opposition than they do with constructing a unified strategic plan. The fragmentation and political dysfunction of the opposition is not kind of something over here while the funding of the insurgency is over here. The one causes and supports the other. Money flowing in from the Qataris, money flowing in from the Turks, money flowing in from the Saudis, and now money flowing in from us. All of this does is helps to increase the fragmentation, separation, internal conflict, internal battling between what is actually a loose amalgam of local militias, local forces, with fluid memberships and varying degrees of control over different areas. I think much more, my punchline is that we should be, as we have been for the last 6 months, putting much more effort into trying to do the centralization, organization, and political leadership of the provision of aid to the Syrian opposition than thinking that simply providing arms is going to do the trick. But the bottom line is that the arming of the rebels has been going on for a long time in a decentralized way, and that Unless we can get control over that, we're simply going to be adding to it rather than qualitatively changing it. Number two, the assumption that we can radically change this through the provision of arms assumes that Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria's other external backers are essentially maxed out. In other words, they've given everything they can, and if we add to the mix, we will then shift to create a balance favorable to the opposition. Maybe the foreign backers of Assad simply respond by increasing their aid, and you simply have an escalatory ladder. I suppose this is an empirical question about whether the Iranians and the Russians are maxed out, but I see no evidence whatsoever that they are. Third, I simply do not believe that we will drive away jihadists by becoming more involved in the conflict. I mean, that's not the lesson of any place else in the world. The lesson the rest of the world is that when we're involved, the jihadists love being there even more, and that they will continue to fight us, and that they will be able to use our involvement, open and public now, as a pretty good argument as to why the ones receiving our weapons are not, in fact, authentic representatives of the Syrian people, of Islam, and of this grand Sunni jihad against the infidels. In other words, the idea that the jihadists will simply step back and say, gee, we had a good run, but now the Americans are funding the moderate rebels strikes me as exceedingly unlikely. The United States has been deeply and correctly worried that some of its weapons will flow to these jihadist groups. And now we are told that the CIA has decided that they have identified the good guys and that they can provide guns to them, and those guns will not go to the jihadists. I find this to be ridiculous. Insurgencies do insurgency things. That is what they do. Car bombs blowing up in Damascus, that's what insurgencies do. The idea that, okay, there's some bad jihadists, but most of them are just opportunists, and they're fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra because, they have better weapons. If we have better weapons, they'll come to our side. A key part in the causal chain is just logically insane, because once we have attracted these opportunists to our side with better weapons, and now they have those better weapons, and the winds shift, and now the jihadists suddenly get more weapons, why in the world wouldn't these avowed opportunists switch back? What would hold them in place? You would think that what might hold them in place would be a strong, centralized command and control, but we know that doesn't exist. In other words, the idea that the provision of weapons is going to somehow marginalize and isolate and remove the jihadist presence in Syria strikes me as deeply implausible. Particularly because the insertion of more guns and moving up the escalatory ladder means that the fighting is going to get bloodier. It is going to get nastier. All of the pressures that Andrew so correctly identified will increase and escalate. There might be some examples out there in the world of people becoming more moderate and less disposed to radical ideas as conflict increases and the state collapses and the blood flows. I'm not aware of them. I think more likely radical ideas will become more attractive as the fighting escalates and as the state collapse accelerates. So, I'm sure that there are some good rebels, and I hope we can support them, but I think that we should have no illusions whatsoever that we will have lasting influence or control over them, or that they are aligned with our values, or that we can, kind of place our bets on them, and that they will then deliver on our behalf. I think that if we give guns to a particular general and then we say, we don't like what you did to that local community, we're not going to support you anymore, he will probably say, okay, we'll get our guns from someplace else now. One of the key things that I hear now, unfortunately, or one of the things that's changed is with the change in Qatar, and even before that, the idea that the Qataris are out and the Saudis are now taking the lead, and this is a good thing that the Saudis are now taking the lead in the organization and arming of the opposition. Let me just say, I'm just going to throw this out there, that if you're counting on Saudi Arabia to deliver a liberal, democratic, anti-sectarian, and non-Islamist opposition, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. So, what will arming the rebels be good at? It'll be very good for deflecting political pressure in Washington to do more for a while. It'll be pretty good at deflecting pressure in the Gulf for us to show leadership by doing what they want us to do. It'll give John Kerry some chips in diplomacy, and it'll temporarily strengthen our proxies relative to others. All of those will be good for a month or so, and then we'll be right back to where we've been, which is then having arguments about when and whether to begin airstrikes, no-fly zones, and the like. I don't think all is hopeless. There are useful things we can do. Andrew outlined many of them. We should be doing much more to build the political opposition. We should be doing much more to channel all aid through the political leadership of the opposition, both military and non-military. We should be doing more, although we've been trying, I promise you we've been trying, to knock heads with our allies in the Gulf. And hey, maybe that'll help, maybe the arming maybe the provision of arms will give us some more leverage over the Saudis and others to kind of fall in line, maybe. We should be doing those things, but I have I'm not going to stand up here and promise you that this is the magic solution that's going to solve this problem. I don't think there is a solution, and I think that that is a very depressing way to end this, but I shall.
Great. Mark, Andrew, thank you both very much. I now have the great pleasure to be a provocateur and a devil's advocate against both of your positions. And I think it's important, I would like to at least begin to focus on the higher strategic level about what the objectives are, rather than the tactical implementation level for a moment. And so let me ask each of you this question, or ask each of you a question. First to Andrew, you mentioned in your opening remarks that we have three parts of Syria, effectively, with three different U.S. designated terrorist organizations fighting each other. The question that Vance Serchuk addressed in today's post, op-ed, is a very good question. Isn't this a great blessing, this conflict? Three terrorist organizations killing each other? My gosh, we'll come back, in a year or two, and there'll be fewer terrorists in the world. And in the meantime, let's protect the Jordanians, let's protect the Turks, let's make sure it doesn't overflow the borders. Isn't that a reasonable strategy? And Mark, on the total other side, my gosh, the Iranians are all in. The Russians are there. Hezbollah is all in. Are we going to lose? Do we really want the Iranians to win here? Shouldn't the fundamental prime directive, to use Star Trek terms, be to ensure that the Iranians and the Hezbollahis don't win and do whatever it is necessary to make sure that that terrible calamity doesn't happen? Gentlemen?
Rob, that's not the first time. It's the first time you've asked me that question. It's not the first time I've had this discussion. It has a certain cold-hearted calculus to it, doesn't it? I mean, we have the enemies, sworn enemies of the United States, those that have killed Americans, or their tentacles have killed Americans over the years, all fighting each other. And doesn't that sound great? Well, again, I think it gets back to the situation that would all work. It all works until it doesn't work. And what I mean by that is that kind of works until that crisis or that conflict becomes uncontainable within the current boundaries of that arena. And I think that's what I've argued in the piece, and what I argued a little bit earlier. I think it becomes very, very difficult to contain that, because what you end up doing is destroying a country. You can end up destroying a people, but also actually expanding politically extremism among the three different areas. And I don't think that's something that's in our interest. Now, making this more dangerous, so they're dangerous to our immediate allies. And here we're looking at, like I said before, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and Iraq. But I think making this more dangerous is, I don't feel comfortable or safe at all knowing that this kind of battle with these kind of groups taking place is going around, is centered around in an area where we have the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the Middle East. Now, I realize, as of now, most assessments are that they are in regime hands. We can't guarantee that going forward. A lot of these things are loaded into shells that can be fired from artillery pieces. This is not stuff that can be easily kept under lock and key over time. And I think that in itself has a number of downside risks to it. So beyond the disturbance of the regional security architecture, you have that. Now that supercharges it and sends it, I think, in many ways global. And I think that's the reason why President Obama outlined it as a direct threat. I mean, there are a number of ways that it's a direct threat, but so the other, I think, as that conflict expands, what I'm really worried about is I think it's perfectly feasible going forward that we could have the Sykes-Picot boundaries in a de jure sense in place, but in a de facto sense, we will have so many Syrians in so many different areas that it will become part of that greater Syria that so many Syrians talk to me about, but now probably don't really want, right? And I think that in itself, you know, the destabilization of the northern provinces of Jordan in itself I think is also a threat, and that area being politically filled up with extremists. So getting to Marc's earlier point, and it dovetails with Rob's question, right? And I guess I say this in the article, I think I say it in the article directly, but I'll say it, if not, I'll say it directly here. In a way, no, in most ways, this is a political operation using military means, okay? Because we're shaping a rapidly changing environment. And so that in and of itself, like Marc said very rightly, makes this much, much more complicated and hard, right? Now, the thing I would add to that is that of the 4 steps that I outlined, okay, all these don't have to go in order, and we don't have to do all of them at the same time. And I think this is one of the challenges. The great challenge, I believe, of leadership going forward in the region, and this is what, and I guess I learned this lesson a bit from, I hate to say it, the Iranians, and watching our adversaries engage, battle with us, is that they are very good at looking at the full dashboard of options and very subtly turning this knob off and turning this one on and throwing this switch on and throwing this switch off. And they're very, very good at that, right? Because obviously they don't have public pressure to go up the escalation chain. They can say, yes, we're doing this, or give some rhetoric, and in the end they can do what they want. I think Marc's right. Oftentimes we get locked into a situation where we believe we have to go all in, right? I don't think that's what's going to win it in Syria necessarily. It might at a certain point. We don't know what's going to happen. There are a lot of unknowns here, but you know, it's going to be a much more complicated situation. And I'll end with this. And I totally agreed. I was recently in Israel, was meeting a very, very senior security intelligence official who I respect very much and who many of you I think know. And he said to Jeff White and I, at a military base at the end of the day when we were all thinking about this crisis, he said, this is the most complicated challenge that Israel has ever faced, and the IDF. And I was I was taken aback, right? This is a country that's faced a lot of challenges. He said, I didn't say it was the biggest. I said it was the most complicated. And he said, and we're nowhere close to the end of it. So I don't think it's just the United States that thinks along these lines. I think our allies like Israel in the region think along similar lines as well.
Okay. Marc?
Yeah, good questions. And again, I want to emphasize once again, if it wasn't clear from before, that actually I agree with a lot of Andrew's recommendations. He does, in the article, have a very good and I think a very useful politics-first approach to this, with the military actions and the arming in support of the political objectives. And so, I mean, I recommend that. And I didn't mean to say that you didn't. Others, not so much, but I think that is important. In terms of, you know, I actually don't agree with either your question to Andrew or to me. I don't agree with the bleed it out, let them fight it out. You know, the Hezbollah and Al Qaeda are killing each other. What's the problem? I don't agree with that simply because, you know, they're not just killing each other. They're killing thousands and thousands of Syrians and doing all of the other things we've been talking about. And it's also not a zero-sum game. The whole you know, from Iraq, the flypaper idea that you can just like attract all the bad guys there and then kill them was very silly, because you're generating just as many you're exacerbating the radicalization process elsewhere, and so it's not like there's a fixed sum or zero sum. I mean, one of the most worrying things about what's been happening, and I've been writing about it extensively lately, is the way that this is turning into very much kind of a region-wide and even international-wide sectarian campaign, this sectarian Sunni jihad, which actually is very much along the lines of what we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s, or Bosnia or others, kind of Saudi-led, using media, using mosques, using all these religious networks to mobilize people and to get them to provide money to come and fight. And again, so it's not just the jihadists who are doing these things, it's also kind of the mainstream, the ones that we're working with. And if you think about it like that, what you're looking at then is, yeah, think about it like, little kernels of popcorn, and yeah, some of them might, come over and die in Syria, but more and more of them are popping all over the region. So, the notion, at least on the Sunni side, that that there's a fixed number of these guys that you can kill, I think is just wrong. On the other side, are we really going to let Iran win? I think this gets to the nub of the strategic, the question of overall strategic goals. There's a column that I wrote 2 weeks ago, which we have not decided as a government, as a policy community, and I think people really disagree about. Is Syria a civil war which needs to be solved, or is it a front in a regional war against Iran which needs to be won? These are different things. And the steps which might be taken to stop the killing, find a political transition in Syria, are not the ones that you would take if what you really wanted to do was to bleed Iran and to fight it out and the like. I mean, I think that understanding what that strategic objective is going to be difficult, and it gets back to the point I was making in my comments before, which is that I think that we don't agree with our allies about these things. I think, for example, the Jordanians and the Turks would probably prefer to solve this problem because it's threatening to overwhelm their countries, at least in Jordan's case, whereas the Saudis, I think, would be perfectly happy to keep fighting Iran to the last dead Syrian. I mean, that's to them, the strategy you're describing makes perfect sense. What do we think? I think that we haven't really articulated it.
Okay, let's open the floor to your questions. We'll start with Tom right here, and then we'll go in the far back. And if you could, when you get the mic, if you could make sure you identify yourselves, that'd be great. Tom, right on your right.
This has been a fascinating discussion, and it's sort of like the war itself. There's not going to be a winner here for a while. My question is directed to Andrew. A few months ago,
who's on whose side?
A few months ago, I was listening to a similar discussion at a conference in Houston, and when you get that far outside the Beltway, you hear some different ways of looking at this kind of thing, right? And one of the speakers presented this argument that the Sykes-Picot arrangements, far from being the so-called security architecture of the region, have in fact been an artificial overlay imposed by outsiders that has prevented the inevitable sorting out that ought to have taken place in the 1920s after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Then it was held, the colonialists prevented it from happening, and then Cold War constraints prevented it from happening. It's happening now and it can't be prevented, and we should step out of the way and go with the winner. I take it you don't agree with that.
Yeah, I don't agree with it. I think that the reason why I see it as a major concern is because a lot of things have happened since the Sykes-Picot boundaries were drawn, right? I mean, nations, as imperfect as they are, oftentimes were built. Security arrangements, armies were raised. In the case of Syria, and I think this is really important, and again, I get back to my earlier point, they also then bought and produced the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the Middle East, right? So the breakup of Syria itself, to me, I think, threatens a lot of that other architecture. So the downsides of this breaking down are, I believe, so great on so many different levels that it would create a political, enough political and military chaos that would actually probably lead to that great Armageddon war that we're all probably trying to avoid. And that's the reason why I would like to keep it contained within Syria. It's pretty straightforward. That might not all occur. Maybe there'll be some areas that bleed out. But the reason why I wrote this article was very clear, and that is I see the meltdown, the Chernobyling of Syria as a threat to U.S. interests on a number of levels. And I think we're invested in that architecture. It's 100 years old, for better or for worse. I think just letting everybody get it out of their systems is not wise. I think we should put some constraints on that. We might not be able to control everything. Mark's right about the subhead of the article. And I think you all know that's just the way it goes when you publish something. But in as much as we can try and shape that, I think that's very important for our assets in the region.
In the far back, yeah.
Thank you very much, Rob. My name is Edward Joseph with Johns Hopkins SAIS, and agree with the previous questioner that this is absolutely a terrific event. I would like to take up Mark's challenge, if I could, to give you an example of where arming insurgents made the decisive difference, and of course that is Bosnia, 1995, well actually beginning 1994. But the arming, and I would underscore the training of both Croats in particular and Bosniak forces were the key determinant, not NATO airstrikes. Actually, it was the improvement in the capacity of the ground forces that made the difference on the ground, that brought the Serbs to the negotiating table seriously at Dayton, and that's what made the agreement possible. Of course, there are many differences. And with someone who I'm sure you're quite familiar with, Elizabeth O'Baggy, she and I have written an article in the National Interest that examines the differences between, and the similarities between Bosnia and Syria. Among them is, and this is just to get to Andrew's point about Bosnia on steroids, that of course Syria has over 5 times the population, meaning you'd have to have on the order of about 500,000 to 600,000 casualties to have the same relative impact that you had in Bosnia, and of course the many other differences. My question, Rob, to Andrew is, Mark has made...
We're going to have to hold it there.
Okay, can I ask a question though, quickly? Mark has basically said that intervening would be futile. Do you agree? And could you address that point? And to Mark, what about Iran?
Stop.
Thank you.
Stop. Okay. Mark.
Great. Okay, Bosnia. I'm glad that I'm glad you mentioned Bosnia and didn't confuse it with Kosovo like some columnists. Yes, you're right. What tipped the balance in Bosnia was the arming of the Croatian military and their conventional victory in against Serbian forces. What did not tip the balance was the creation of safe areas, which proved to be unenforceable, airstrikes, which proved to make very little contribution to the actual resolution of the conflict. It was only the full-scale arming and the victory of the Croatian army which did the trick. I'm not sure who you envision playing the role of the Croatian army in this scenario. Maybe the Turks, maybe, I'm not sure. But it was not the arming of Bosnian insurgents. It was the arming of a conventional military, which then won a conventional military victory. At the end of that conventional military victory, there was the Dayton peace, the Dayton process, in which we then took Milosevic and legitimated him in power, made him a key part of the solution, and he only shows up in The Hague many years later, after Kosovo, and basically what it involved was agreeing to the partition of the country and legitimating the role of the architect of the massacres, being willing to wine and dine and drink whiskey with the guy and not seek international justice, and then basically having that be enforced through IFOR, a major international peacekeeping operation with the tacit acceptance, or actually the overt acceptance, of Russia and the neighbors. If you're willing to go all the way and envision Assad's role equivalent to Milosevic's, finding someone to play the role of the Croatian army, avoiding international justice and giving Bashar that particular role, then I think that is a plausible path. But I'm not sure that it's the one that most people really have in mind. So yes, I mean I think it's a very good thought experiment to work through. But I'm not sure it has the lessons that some people might think.
Why don't you hold back? Why don't you hold for now? Let's get another couple of questions. Saad, over here.
Thank you, Rob. My name is Saeed Arikat from Al Quds Daily newspaper. A quick question to Mark. Was the president too precipitous in saying that Assad must go, and actually painted himself into a corner inflexible on diplomacy, and to Andrew, is Geneva dead for all practical? Is Geneva II dead for all practical purposes? Thank you.
Andrew, why don't you start, and you can get in your last comment. Sure.
Okay, arming the rebels. No, I don't think it's a futile exercise. However, as you noticed, the recent announcement was to arm the Supreme Military Council, and which is essentially the armed affiliate of SOC, the Syrian Opposition Coalition. Now, that organization was created around the same time as SOC, secretly off on the wings between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and we have a paper that's coming out from the Washington Institute that tracks a little bit of this. Now, overall, the SMC has many good qualities. It includes a number of defectors from the Syrian military, people who I've met. Now, the problem is, in my opinion, given that we've seen the growth of extremism within the opposition's ranks, is that within the SMC are a number of Salafist leaders. Okay? Now, why is that a problem? I think in two instances. One is they are closer politically and in terms of common cause with extremists now designated by the U.S. government, including Jabhat al-Nusra. And so the weapons that are provided via those channels could very well leak out. Now, they might not just leak out via those channels. I think Mark pointed out others too. You know, a lot of things happen when you move weapons through a checkpoint, and people in Lebanon have told me how that used to work too. So, you know, offloading of weapons is yeah, exactly, is a very, very common one. So that's my first one. What was the thing? Oh, yes. Okay. Now, this is also very important. This is also where I take issue with the administration. Okay. In my opinion, Geneva II was dead when the team that was negotiating this in Geneva took, which was not a bad text, and we took it to St. Petersburg and met with Putin and changed the language that said that all of this has to be agreed upon by mutual consent and all this stuff backwards. I think what it did is it seemed like a diplomatic way to get this through, and it was, but what it did is it made it unenforceable, okay? Because you have to get Assad to agree to go himself, which he's not going to do, right? And you have to get the opposition to agree as well. So at the time it was seen as a check by the opposition on the regime's announcements and calculations, you know, in this process. I think what it does is now it gives this process, if we continue with it, gives Assad that lease on life, and he will continue. And I said this earlier today to a few friends. Look, I've covered 2 Syrian elections in my life, okay? And it was not pleasant, okay? And I can tell you, yeah, and they were begging me to vote, yeah, with blood from my thumb, okay? So as funny as that was, okay, there is a less than 0 chance that anybody else than Bashar al-Assad will win if he runs in 2014 or if they oversee that transition. Okay, it's going to take a lot more than that, or some American center that oversees the elections. It has to be something else more than that. And that's where I agree with the administration, and that's where I differ with the Russians. A true transition means we move it from this little cabal of people over to a group of people that represent the demographic differences inside of the country, and those that have changed over time. Okay, and getting there is tough. So I think that's why Geneva is flawed. And I don't see the meeting happening soon because it seems like the United States and Russia are still at odds, which would keep it from happening.
Mark, was the president too precipitous?
Ms. Ericat's question. Yes. I mean, there was a huge amount of pressure at the time for the president to come out and take this forceful position that Assad must go. And I wrote a piece at the time, still one of my all-time favorite column headlines. It was "Expellus Assadum." The idea that this was a magical incantation that just by saying it you would make it so. Clearly it wasn't. We knew it at the time, and it did exactly what the chemical weapons red line did. It created a set of expectations which could not be met. Now, I think we all, on all sides, well, Emil Hokaim earlier today convinced me that he was not among this group, but most of us I think, miscalculated Assad's ability to survive. My calculation of it was that as long as when it was a peaceful uprising being butchered, that Assad couldn't survive because of the moral force of nonviolent protest, what this would do to the Syrian, kind of the middle ground, and that he simply couldn't survive in that way. Once it turned into a military confrontation, my estimation of his likely survival went way up. I think that people who wanted an early military intervention also misjudged. The idea that at the first sign of a NATO jet, Assad would run for the hills clearly was not right. And I think that we all, not just the president, got that wrong. But I think that the Assad must go at that stage as a descriptive statement by someone like me. Sure, that's a reasonable analytic judgment. As a declarative statement by the president, probably shouldn't have been made.
Okay, Ken Timmerman right here, Stanley, and then in the way back.
Ken Timmerman, thank you for this terrific discussion. Andrew, I have a question for you about chemical weapons and the so-called red line that has allegedly been crossed. If you recall, and I'm sure all of us do here, the Iraq War, there was a great deal of evidence presented to Congress, presented to the United Nations, presented to the public by the administration of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, what they were doing with them. In this case, we have a declaration by the president. As far as I know, we don't even have anything presented to Congress, either in classified form or unclassified form. You have the head of the EU's diplomacy, Catherine Ashton, saying that their analysis is that the rebels use chemical weapons. So what's the evidence, and why hasn't the administration presented it?
Okay, hold on. Stanley Cover in front.
Stanley Cover, this is a good bookend to that question. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, know your enemy, know yourself. Let's stress to know yourself. Rob said, shouldn't we do whatever is necessary? Would the American people be willing to support that? Doesn't strategy have to be viewed through that prism? What do you think the American people would support now? What degree of intervention?
I don't know if that's a question to me or not, but yes, in the back.
Hi, Mona Shakaki with Al Arabiya. I want to get Mark and Andrew to answer each other. So, Andrew, tell us what happens when mission creep happens, like Mark was wondering about. What happens if we don't solve the issue and the Syrian war continues to get out of hand and no-fly zones aren't enough? And Mark, if you could let us know, answer Andrew's main concern, which is what happens when this becomes much more regional. Great.
Okay, why don't we start from that? Yeah, this is going to be the final round of questions. So, gentlemen, you want to start, Mark?
Okay. I'm glad Mona asked me a question, so I don't have to answer Ken's. Look, like I said, I expect this to be a long-term war which is increasingly internationalized and is shaping the entire region, and we should have no illusions about that. The question about Sykes-Picot, Tom's question from before, I actually think Arab states are much more resilient than we often think they are. I think back when Iraq was happening at its worst, a lot of people thought that something similar was going to happen, and it really didn't. I'm actually shocked in some ways that the Kurds are still, that they haven't left Iraq yet. I think that speaks to something about the resilience and power of that supposedly fragile state structure. Interestingly, though, and with Lebanon, I actually feel like Lebanon and Syria are so interrelated that I actually think there's a very high chance that I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more spillover from Syria into Lebanon, more fighting in Lebanon than we've already seen. And unfortunately, I expect that probably will happen, especially now that Hezbollah is openly involved. I think Jordan is actually going to be okay. I think we should help it. We should support it. But I think Jordan, for better or for worse, has long experience with massive flows of refugees, endemic security threats, and they're pretty good at handling those sorts of things. We should support them, but I'm not as worried about Jordan. Turkey, I think they'll also pretty much be okay. The one that I really am worried about, though, is Iraq. And I think that Iraq has its own internal issues. Maliki's creeping authoritarianism has been going on for a long time, before the United States left, after the United States left. The violence in Aardvark goes up and down. All of that stuff is constant, but the increasing integration between the Syrian insurgency and the Iraqi Iraqi Sunni insurgency and the flows of weapons and personnel back and forth is deeply worrying, I think, and does introduce a new factor in there. That's less, I don't know how responsive to your question that is, but thinking about the spread out, I think that's where, of all the many ways in which this might play out, that's the one that worries me the most, is the spillover into Iraq.
Yes, it's a good question, right? The Obama administration, from my understanding of its internal deliberations and some that leaked out to the press, was concerned because of the slam dunk that we had on Iraq, right? And of course, the embarrassment that comes from that, and the miscalculations that came from that, and so on. So they were very cautious about that from the beginning, that they really wanted to make sure. So the assessments of the United States are shared by the UK and France, of its allies. Of the Arab allies, I'm not sure. Of Israel, I think that I think they also share that assessment. It might be based on something slightly different, simply because I heard from Israeli circles earlier what we eventually heard, some of which we eventually heard, so I'm not sure about that. So in order to gather that evidence, it was not only based on accounts of what happened, interviews with those inside of the country, but then they actually they were involved in bringing out doctors who were treating those patients, individuals who had been exposed to those agents, and also, I believe, corpses as well. But I'm not exactly sure on that last detail. And they tested those individuals and those bodies and found that they were exposed to low doses of, or moderate doses of sarin. So that is the evidence that I know about out there. There's probably a lot more of it, given that there would be other ways to go about it. And so that's how they I think Obama's language with a high degree of certainty. I think that was the language that he used. And the fact that that this came out of the White House, I think, is not insignificant, given how hesitant they were to for this slam dunk to reoccur, so to speak. Muna, always a good question. What happens with mission creep? I think what happens there is leadership. And I know that's really a casual thing to say. I'm not saying this from a partisan standpoint because I'm from the same party as the president. But what you do is that you look at what happens, you look at what's happening inside of the country, and you turn one knob off and you turn another one on, instead of automatically going up the escalation chain. Now, it's hard because your political opponents oftentimes pound you for being a wimp under certain circumstances, right? And that's the way democracy oftentimes works. And in this particular case, given the complexities of it, I think the president's going to have to find a way to navigate all of that. And the American public is cautious. Now, they're cautious now, given the way that they believe it's affecting them and the way it's been articulated by the leadership. Part of leadership is framing the issues and the risks accordingly so that when an increase in those risks to the country occur, that the American public is ready for it and ready to do what is necessary. So right now we don't know what those are. But for all this, for example, to go on, as I argue in the piece, in the neighborhood where we have, 65% of the world's oil reserves and 40% of its gas reserves, I realize that they don't occur inside of Syria, but the risks to those supplies, the risk of that can spread. And what I learned, I grew up in a community where oil was discovered in the 19th century, and what was the number one lesson that we learned in my county growing up in history class was the important part of oil is not its supply necessarily, it's the price. Okay, and this is the most important thing. So that's another way that this could affect the everyday Americans beyond, for example, this spilling out and affecting our regional allies in a more comprehensive way, such as Israel, and I believe that it will. Or our other allies such as Jordan. And in that particular case, we would have to respond accordingly. And again, I outline in this piece what I believe are assertive and measured steps, not aggressive steps, but assertive ones, and ones that can help shape this conflict positively.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo Andrew's last comment, Stanley's question. My own view, for what it's worth, is that I find all these polls about America's interest in engaging irrelevant, in the sense that if the leadership of the United States hasn't explained to the American people whether it's important or not, one certainly shouldn't expect average voters to think that it's important, and that the real poll will be when and if the leadership says it's important. Then we'll be able to judge whether people think that it's important. But we're not there yet, and we may not be there. And that, I think, is the end result of this debate. is that we still don't really know what the overall strategy is. Although we have a pretty good, reasonable consensus on what to do, even in the absence of a strategy, which is really fascinating. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Do it again.